Viking queens, secret horrors, how they survived brutal rituals, dark history. The smoke rises, thick and acrid from the funeral pyre, mingling human flesh with sacred oak. Queen Sigrid's fingers dig into the carved armrests of her throne, knuckles white as winter bone, as she watches her husband's body consumed by flames that dance like demons in the twilight. Around her, the assembled jarls and warriors chant ancient words that seem to claw at the very air itself, but it is not grief that makes her hands tremble. It is knowing what comes next. The high priest approaches, his staff adorned with raven skulls clicking against the stone with each deliberate step. His eyes, black as the void between worlds, fix upon her with terrible purpose. The ritual blade in his weathered hand catches the firelight, its edge honed sharp enough to split a hair, sharp enough to carve the flesh from her living body. The queen must prove her worthiness. His voice cuts through the smoke like steel through silk. She must endure the trials of blood and iron, or forfeit her crown to the flames. The crowd falls silent. Even the crackling pyre seems to hush its hungry roar. Sigrid knows that behind their respectful bows and lowered eyes, they hunger for her failure, her screams, her blood upon the sacred stones. For in the brutal world of the Vikings, a queen's power was never given. It was carved from suffering, forged in pain, and paid for in ways that would shatter lesser souls. What horrors awaited her in the darkness of that ritual chamber? What price would she pay to keep her crown? 3 moons before her husband's death, Queen Sigrid had ruled from her great hall like a she-wolf among sheep. The massive timbers of the royal longhouse groaned under the weight of carved dragon heads, their eyes inlaid with amber that seemed to follow every movement in the flickering torchlight. Tapestries woven with threads of gold and silver depicted the great victories of her lineage. Ships cutting through storm-tossed seas, warriors standing victorious over fields of the fallen. The air hung heavy with the scent of roasted meat, mead that flowed like honey from the gods, and the ever-present undertone of wood smoke that seeped into every surface, every breath. When Sigrid walked these halls, her silk-lined furs rustled against the rushes strewn across the stone floor, and the great iron bracelets upon her arms chimed against the Danes. She remembered the screams that echoed from the sacred grove for 3 days and nights, remembered how her mother emerged, changed, her eyes holding shadows that never fully lifted, her hands bearing scars that told stories she would never speak aloud. The high priest Ragnar had watched Sigrid even then, his ravens perched upon his shoulders like harbingers of fate. He had marked her with his gaze, and she had known that someday the rituals would claim her too. For this was the price of queenship in the north. To rule, one must first survive what would destroy ordinary mortals. In the great hall, surrounded by the warmth of hearth fires and the gleam of treasure, it had seemed almost like a distant nightmare. But when King Ulf's fever took him in the depths of winter, when his body grew cold despite the blazing fires and the desperate prayers of the court shamans, Sigrid felt the old darkness creeping closer, smelled the ritual smoke already beginning to burn. The laws were ancient and absolute. No woman could hold a throne through marriage alone. She must prove herself through trial, through agony, through surviving what the gods themselves had designed to winnow the weak from the strong. And in the shadows of the royal court, she caught the hungry glances of those who would see her fail, rival nobles who coveted her lands, priests who whispered that the gods frowned upon her rule, warriors who believed no woman's hand should grip a sword or crown. The ritual chamber lay beneath the great hall, carved from living rock and older than memory itself. As the iron door groaned shut behind her, Sigrid felt the weight of centuries pressing down upon her shoulders like the hand of a giant. The air here tasted of copper and ancient fear. How many queens had breathed their last gasps in this place? How many had screamed until their voices broke against these unforgiving stones? Torches burned in iron sconces, their flames casting writhing shadows that seemed to mock her with their dance. The walls bore carvings that hurt to look upon, twisted runes that spoke of bargains made with entities that dwelt beyond the reach of mortal understanding. And at the chamber's heart sat the iron throne of trials, its surface black with the blood of generations, its armrests shaped like grasping claws that had held fast to struggling flesh. High Priest Ragnar moved with deliberate ceremony. his robe your fear. Only when your blood has fed the ancient stones may you proceed to the trial of the burning rings. Sigrid's breath caught as she glimpsed the crown, a circlet of black iron twisted into thorns sharp as razors, each point designed to pierce deep enough to draw blood, but not deep enough to grant the mercy of unconsciousness. And coiled around the base of the iron throne she saw them moving, vipers with eyes like burning coals, their scales patterns of silver and black that seemed to shift and writhe even when they lay still. But as Ragnar lifted the crown toward her head, Sigrid saw something that made her blood freeze in her veins. There, carved into the base of the iron throne, where only she could see it from her angle, was a symbol she recognized, the mark of her mother's house, but not as it should be. This was the mark, twisted, corrupted, bearing additional runes that spoke of betrayal, of secrets sold to enemies, of a queen who had not merely survived the trials, but had helped to design them. Her mother had not been a victim of the ritual trials, she had been their architect. The realization struck her like lightning. All those years her mother had worn the facade of a broken queen, scarred by duty and ritual, while in truth she had been in league with the high priests to ensure that only those who served their dark purposes would survive to rule. The trials were not tests of worthiness, they were mechanisms of control, designed to break the spirit of any who might challenge the true power that lurked behind the throne. And now Ragnar's eyes glittered with anticipation, not because he expected her to fail, but because he expected her to be remade in their image, moulded by agony into another puppet dancing to their ancient tune. The crown of thorns was not meant to test her strength, it was meant to shatter her will, to open her mind to influences that would make her their creature, as her mother had been before her. "Your mother chose wisdom," Ragnar whispered as he lowered the crown toward her head. "She learned that there are powers older than kings and queens, older than the gods themselves. Powers that reward those wise enough to serve." The thorns bit into her scalp and Sigrid felt warm blood begin to trickle down her forehead. But even as the serpents began to slither toward her feet, their tongues tasting the air for her terror, she made a choice that would change everything. She would not merely endure these trials, ritual itself. The runes carved into the chamber walls began to glow with sickly light, as powers older than memory stirred from their slumber, and the very foundations of the longhouse above began to tremble. High Priest Ragnar's composure shattered like ice in a forge fire. His face, which had worn the mask of serene authority for decades, twisted into something bestial as he realized what she had done. "You cannot!" he shrieked, his voice cracking like a boy's. "The compact must be maintained. The old powers demand their due." But Sigrid's blood, flowing freely from beneath the crown of thorns, had already begun to work changes that could not be undone. As each crimson drop struck the ancient stones, the very air crackled with unleashed energy, the chamber filled with the sound of splitting stone, as cracks spread like spiderwebs across walls that had stood for 1,000 years. The serpents writhed in agony as the power that had bound them to serve began to consume them from within, their scales blackening and falling away like ash. Above in the great hall, the feast turned to chaos. Tapestries burst into flame without cause, and the carved dragon heads began to bleed real blood that pooled upon the rush-strewn floor. Warriors who had drunk deep of mead found themselves choking on liquid that had turned to molten iron in their throats. The very timbers of the longhouse groaned and buckled, as if giant hands sought to tear the structure apart, board by board. Ragnar lunged for her, his ritual blade gleaming, but the crown of thorns had granted Sigrid more than pain. It had given her sight beyond the veil of mortal perception. She saw him now as he truly was, not an aged priest, but something far older and more terrible, his flesh a mere disguise worn over bones that belonged to no earthly creature. His blade passed through the space where she had been, for she moved now with the fluid grace of one who danced between worlds. The iron door to the chamber exploded outward in a shower of sparks and twisted metal. Through the breach poured the nobles and warriors of the court, their faces masks of terror as they witnessed the collapse of everything they had believed immutable. Some fell to their knees, begging mercy from powers they did not understand. Others drew their swords and charged, only to watch their blades shatter against forces that laughed at mortal steel. Lady Astrid, her mother, doomed us all to feed the endless appetite of entities that care nothing for mortal concerns. The longhouse above collapsed entirely, its massive timbers crashing down in a symphony of destruction that could be heard across the fjord. But, in the chamber below, something far more profound was taking place. The ancient bindings that had held the dark powers in check for centuries were unravelling like poorly woven cloth. And through the gaps in reality, things began to peer through. Things with eyes like dying stars and voices that spoke in frequencies that made mortal minds bleed. Sigrid stood at the eye of this supernatural storm, her body wreathed in power that burned like cold fire, her voice carrying across the chaos with authority that made the very foundations of the world tremble. "I am no puppet queen," she declared. "I am no creature of shadow or servant of ancient fears. I am Sigrid Ironwill, and I claim this throne by right of conquest over the powers that would control it." But even as she spoke these words, she felt the price of her defiance beginning to exact its toll. The power flowing through her was not meant for mortal vessels, and her body began to pay the cost in ways that went far beyond mere physical suffering. The dawn light filtered through the ruins of what had once been the greatest longhouse in the north, illuminating a scene that would haunt the survivors for generations to come. Where Queen Sigrid's throne had stood, only a circle of blackened stone remained, fused into glass by forces that had no names in mortal tongues. The chamber below had collapsed entirely, its ancient secrets buried beneath tons of rubble that no earthly power would ever shift. Those who lived to tell the tale spoke in whispers of the figure they had seen walking away from the destruction. A woman who bore Sigrid's face but moved with steps that left no prints upon the earth, whose eyes held depths that seemed to contain entire worlds of suffering and wisdom. Some claimed she had ascended to join the gods themselves. Others whispered darker truths, that she had become something altogether beyond divine or mortal categorization. The high priests who had served the old compact were found dead at dawn, their bodies unmarked but their faces frozen in expressions of absolute terror, as if they had witnessed truths too profound for mortal minds to contain. The serpents of the ritual chamber had vanished entirely, leaving only the faint scent of their beds, smiles upon their lips as if they had glimpsed something wonderful and terrible in their final moments. The greatest mystery remained. What had Sigrid truly become in that chamber of horrors? Had she transcended mortality entirely, or had she simply found a way to turn the ancient power's own weapons against them? The few who claimed to have seen her in the years that followed could never agree on the details, for each witness seemed to perceive something different. Queen, goddess, demon, or perhaps something that existed in the spaces between such simple categories. And in the ruins of the Great Hall, where the wind howls through broken timbers on the coldest nights, they say you can still hear an echo of that final war cry. Not a sound of triumph or defeat, but something far more unsettling. The cry of someone who had looked into the heart of ultimate power and chosen to remake it in their own image, regardless of the price that choice might exact upon their soul. What price had Queen Sigrid truly paid for her rebellion against the gods themselves? And in the end, had she saved her people from ancient horrors? Or simply replaced one form of darkness with another?